Search and rescue personnel frequently find themselves in situations they didn't imagine, like the time a lost hiker ignores calls from search and rescue teams because he refused to answer a number he didn't know, or the time a hiker decided to go out into the elements with a wet sleeping bag and gave themselves hypothermia. Then there are the really annoying calls where rescue is being requested due to leg cramps or because their packs were too heavy. Then you have the people insisting that search and rescue is taking too long, that they are available for any slight problem that arises. These are real life situations, and while many never bask in the glory of having a story of their own to tell like these, they do happen. But much more commonly, search and rescue is responding to medical incidents. They help the man off the trail after suffering a heart attack, help carry the woman with a broken leg to the waiting ambulance. And in a broad sense, they save lives. It is simple as that. They do it for the duty, not to be hailed as heroes. But it is those of us on the outside that sees them exactly as that. They are heroes. They are trained in a variety of medical capacities. They are strong and brave, and yet they are undeniably human. Though they are trained well and skilled at their jobs, they are still susceptible to the same fate as you and I. When Mother Nature starts to play by her own secret set of rules, no one, no matter how brave, how strong, or how much knowledge you hold in your head, has the upper hand. And with it, it becomes a survival situation for the rescuer too. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. Hello, welcome back. I am your host, Kayla, and this is an episode that I'm really excited for because I have told part of this story previously. And I've told the side of the people who were lost and needing rescued. But in this episode, we are covering the rescuers' side of things because they also find themselves in a situation which we will, of course, be getting into in detail. And because of that, this name might sound familiar. Joe Lentini grew up in the heart of the White Mountains in New Hampshire and has been climbing for the majority of his life. As he grew into a young adult, a friend of his that he had been good friends with since they were children asked him to go climbing, and this was all it took, and Joe was hooked. At the time, there were no indoor climbing gyms, so the only outlet was to go outside and climb real walls of granite. And then in the winter months, more hardcore climbers would transition into ice climbing. And for Joe, he would begin to take whole days to go climb. Then those days got longer and longer. Weekends soon turned into weeks, then months. Joe was proud of his, quote, dirtbag climbing days, like the time that he lived at a friend's garage and lived off of brown rice so that way he could go out and climb every day while he was there in Colorado. At about 25 years old, Joe would return to New Hampshire after a friend called and essentially asked him to turn his love for climbing into a career, asking him to help run a climbing school at Eastern Mountain Sports, and this did nothing but propel him further into climbing. He became extremely active in the local climbing community, and this eventually led him into the Mountain Rescue Service. And it didn't take him long to join the service or move up in its ranks. The Mountain Rescue Service is cultivated from a group of some of the most dedicated professional climbers as well as recreational climbers. To be a member of this service, you have to prove yourself in a variety of really terrible conditions. So really only the tough and the dedicated pass the bar to be a part of the service. Joe fit in well with the service and he quickly transitioned to team leader. And within a few years, he met and became very good friends with 28-year-old Albert Dow. Albert was also a great climber and just a friendly person, and he was always determined to do the right thing. Their friendship grew over 2 years that they worked together, as did the rest of the team. The men who made up the Mountain Rescue Service are not your average climbers. They have extensive experience in climbing rock and ice and winter mountaineering. The conditions they are expected to work in are unimaginable, but for these extraordinary men and women, this is part of the job, and they are bold enough to face it head on. The team members are strong and smart, and they keep a calm mind. And while work hats are on, emotions don't have space. They are loyal, predictable, and most of all, prepared. The week of January 23rd, 1982, Joe had been leading some climbs. And on the 23rd specifically, he was guiding a group of 3 climbers to the summit of Mount Washington. Mount Washington is known for its weather to be some of the most severe on Earth because of the shape of the mountain range, which sits at an angle for about 75 miles to each side, or 121 kilometers. As storms move, they enter into the outer edges of this mountain range, and then the range tapers in more and more narrow until it reaches a slight opening, which is where Mount Washington sits. This range is pretty much a funnel for storms, with Mount Washington being the most narrow part. Along with this, Mount Washington sits in the path of 3 major storm routes that pass through the eastern United States, one of which you may be a little bit more familiar with than the others, which is called the polar vortex. This pulls the cold and frigid weather patterns from the north, and this will collide with the other 2 vortex, which one moves laterally across the middle of the United States, and then the third is often associated with hurricane paths and patterns, and it pulls warm and hot and humid weather up from the Gulf and the equator. In addition to this, Mount Washington is largely the tallest point on the eastern side of the United States, sitting at 6,288 feet or 1,917 meters in elevation. The surrounding peaks are nowhere close to Mount Washington's height. The second tallest mountain is about 5 miles or 7 kilometers to the north, and that is Mount Adams at 5,774 feet or 1,760 meters in elevation. This means that as storm systems move into the area, there is nothing to break up the wind current or create any sort of buffer. The storms will collide with the mountain completely unhindered. All of this combines to make Mount Washington one of the worst weather areas in the world. And because of this, the summit of Mount Washington now has a conservatory staffed 24 hours a day, 365 days a year to collect weather data. Some of the severe readings that the conservatory has recorded includes the wind chill dropping to negative 109 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 78 degrees Celsius, which is the coldest wind chill ever recorded in the United States. The second highest wind speed in the world at 231 miles per hour or 372 kilometers per hour, which was recorded back in 1934. And that has only very recently been topped by a cyclone off the coast of Australia, which reached wind speeds of 253 miles per hour or 407 kilometers per hour. And I'm going to go ahead and apologize here for the foreseeable future. We moved very close to a fire station. And of course, they have their processes when they have to report to a call. But the apology that I'm giving is the dog barking in the background because that seems to be harder to edit out than I can sometimes do. Moving on. And on an average day, the mountain will see wind speeds over 75 miles per hour or 121 kilometers per hour about 1/3 of each year. The average daily temperature is 27 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 3 degrees Celsius. Since 1894, more than 160 people have lost their lives on Mount Washington, and this is mostly due to hypothermia. And with the severe weather the mountain frequently sees, it is not hard to imagine how people could succumb to hypothermia so quickly or so frequently. At the time of year, January ice climbing is extremely popular. But with bad weather on the radar, Joe knew that his group of 3 likely wouldn't summit that day. As visibility became more poor, Joe called it and brought his group home. They didn't have a problem with this and trusted that Joe made the right, safest call. But still on the mountain were 20-year-old Jeff Batzer and 17-year-old Hugh Herr. Again, you might remember this episode, or you might remember this story from the prior episode, but we are going to go over their part of this very quickly. Hugh, who again was 17 years old, and his climbing partner, Jeff, who was 20, set out to climb Huntington Ravine to Odell Gully on Mount Washington. Huntington Ravine has seen several winter climbing fatalities due to it being one of the most technical and difficult routes on Mount Washington, but also because of the hazardous weather that Mount Washington gets in the winter months. On January 22nd, 1982, so the day before Joe and the group he was leading was denied the summit, the weather, as you can imagine, wasn't super great, but it also wasn't violent by any means. So Jeff and Hugh decided that they would go for their intended climb. The two hiked 3 miles to Havard Cabin, which is just a small 2-room log cabin that also has some campsites on it. This campsite sits just below Huntington Ravine, which was their intended route. So the following morning, January 23rd, the boys climbed the ravine after staying the night at the cabin. Next, they moved on to Odell's Gully, which is roughly 1,017 feet or 310 meters long and full of ice. Next, they reached the top of the gully, and then about 90 minutes later, they were about 500 meters from the summit, or just over a quarter mile away. The climb was overall very uneventful and completely manageable for these two climbers. And at this point, the weather was starting to deteriorate, but it hadn't yet taken that huge turn for the worse. Jeff threw out the idea of taking a quick run up to the summit, and they agreed that they would go, but if the weather continued to decline, they would turn around. They left their bag full of supplies at the top of the gully so that way they would have a marker for where to go, and this bag contained their overnight gear, map, and compass. Within minutes of their ascent to the summit, the weather did decline, and Hugh and Jeff found themselves in a whiteout so bad that they couldn't determine where they were. They made the very quick decision to turn around and head for the ridge, which was their route down from the peak. The wind at this point was already raging at 100 miles per hour or 160 kilometers per hour, and the wind chill temperature dropped to negative 84 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 64 degrees Celsius. The wind was so strong that it was nearly blowing them off their feet every single time they took a step. And once they reached the tree line and some form of shelter from the wind, they realized that they were not on their intended path. It was theorized that what happened is that as they descended down the ridge, they started on the right path, but the wind blew them so hard that every step they took tracked them more and more to the other side of the ridge. And once they were there, they had no idea where to go, especially because their map had been left with the rest of their gear in their bags. What they didn't know was that they had descended into Great Gulf, and they were now on the wilderness side of the mountain, which basically means that the chances of happening upon a trail or a road or people, especially in January, was very, very, very small. This area of the mountain is one of the designated wilderness areas of White Mountain National Forest. With the thought that down is better than going back to the summit and trying to find their way, they decided to start moving. As they moved lower, they found that the snow was only getting deeper and deeper. In some areas, they were pushing through snow that was as deep as their chest or higher. The snow was so high that it reached the bottom of branches, making travel extremely difficult. However, they found a river that was mostly clear of snow, and they decided to follow this down the mountain. Again, this is usually the right move to make, but they did make one mistake. The river was covered in what appeared to be a solid sheet of ice, and so they decided to walk on the ice, But it was not as thick as they had thought, and Hugh unfortunately cracked through the ice not once, but twice, and fell into knee-deep water both times. At this time, the temperature was around negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 29 degrees Celsius, and now his leather boots and pant legs were soaked. As the sky darkened, Hugh and Jeff found a granite boulder that was about the size of a house, and they were able to dig into the snow in a section of it that kind of had the rock forming a back and ceiling, and the snow remaining as the remaining wall and floor. Here they grabbed pine branches and tossed them onto the snow so that way they could be a little bit more insulated. And then they hugged each other, tangling their legs together, and begged that their body heat would be enough to make it through the night. And it was. And as they tried to descend, they would do this twice more. In the days that followed, the wind speeds increased to more than 140 miles per hour or 225 kilometers per hour. Jeff at one point traded his wool pants with Hugh in an attempt to warm up Hugh's legs. However, by their third day, they could no longer walk. Digging their final snow hole, they climbed in and waited to see what would happen. Hugh's legs were in bad shape. His calves down were frozen solid. Both Jeff and Hugh were hypothermic and had severe frostbite, and after a long conversation, they decided to no longer try to delay what they felt was inevitable. And as they huddled in their snow cave, they moved away from each other so that way they wouldn't have each other's body heat to rely on any longer. Backing up to January 22nd, the Harvard cabin caretaker, Matt Pierce, noticed that Jeff and Hugh hadn't returned to the cabin and decided to report them missing to the Mountain Rescue Service. Joe got the call late that night at about 10 p.m. He had been in his living room with his feet close to the fireplace to keep them warm, and in his chair, his eyes were closing and he was beginning to fall asleep. Of course, that would be when the call comes in. By 5 a.m., the search effort was underway. They had been hoping that Jeff and Hugh would walk off the mountain in the middle of the night, but when that didn't happen, Joe was already ready to take action. He met up with some others at the Pinkham Notch, which is where the Game and Forest Service and other teams arrived to go over the game plan. Joe, being a team leader, is the one who is making decisions and weighing the options. He is the one telling the teams where they need to go. 4 teams of 2 men each were organized, and 3 teams started at the bottom of Odell's Gully and Huntington Ravine. And Joe and his partner Brad got in a snowcat to head higher up the mountain on Mount Washington to search more of the top of that climb. At this point, the weather is terrible. It is well below freezing. I'm talking like negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 23 degrees Celsius. With the high winds blowing the freshly fallen snow all around, they are still looking for these boys in whiteout conditions. Albert Dow and Michael Hartridge were partners during the search, and Albert, again, was an exceptional climber. So he and Michael took to the bottom of the route and they worked their way up. In the meantime, Joe and Brad reached the tree line, and once they passed the tree line and into the alpine zone, they could not continue. The wind was blowing so badly that they were being knocked off their feet, and the storm was clearly still raging. Due to this, the search was called off. The next day, the 4 teams set out again, basically to the same places that they had been in the day before, and this time, Joe and Brad were able to reach the top of Odell's Gully, and they kept looking. But it was while they were here that they began to notice something called wind slabs. Wind slabs are essentially drifted snow that has collected due to it being blown by the wind. The wind is also very good at compressing the snow, and it becomes a problem on certain grades or certain slopes where the fresh fallen loose snow is having denser snow blown and then compressed down on top of it. The weaker snow is, of course, unable to hold this heavy amount of snow, and it eventually breaks loose, creating a huge slab of snow and debris that just avalanches down the mountain. When Joe and Brad see this, they immediately know that they can go no farther. The slab is not safe to cross in any capacity. Meanwhile, Albert and Michael found footprints from Jeff and Hugh, and they decided to follow them since they felt confident that they were on the right tracks, and so they wanted to follow them. But eventually, the tracks disappeared, and Albert and Michael find themselves at yet another dead end. It's 3 p.m., and at this point, they still don't know that the boys are on the other side of the mountain, so they aren't even looking in the right place yet. Conditions, though, again begin to decline, so Joe and Brad go back to the snowcat and make the call to Albert and Michael that they would be coming to get them first. The conditions are so bad that Brad and Joe note that there is just this never-ending feeling that you are not safe. So getting to the snowcat and having this moment where you're like, okay, time to get out of here is a relief, while also being mixed with apprehension for the boys that they are leaving behind. However, the radio didn't crack with confirmation that they understood. Instead, they heard Michael repeatedly say, avalanche. You know that moment where someone tells you something that you weren't expecting and it takes you a few seconds for all the dots to connect? This was one of those moments. Joe and Brad had been expecting a very different response to their call. And instead, as soon as the words sunk in, Brad, who was driving the snowcat, which is a truck-sized machine that has treads that allows it to move across the snow more easily, he puts the pedal down and they rush to where Albert and Michael had been. One of the other rescue groups also heard this, and since they are closer to a cache of first aid gear, they go there and grab some items along with avalanche probes. Members from the Appalachian Mountain Club were also very close, and they were able to respond and get there immediately. As Joe and Brad are working their way up the trail, they actually see a little bit of avalanche debris runout area, and they decide to cut through the tree line and follow that instead. When they push through the trees, they can see Michael, who was partially out of the snow. And he actually had an arm free, and he was able to clear the snow from around his head and then get his radio, which is when he had responded avalanche. As the team started digging Michael out, the rest of the people there started doing what is called a hasty search. So this is where a team kind of, in short, walks around the snow and they look at this avalanche runout area from different perspectives to see if they notice anything about the snow that might indicate that someone is beneath it. When they don't find anything, they use the avalanche probes, which are very long, thin poles, and they are pushed into the snow to look for a body. Someone who is trained can do this by feel because, unlike the solidness of rocks or tree trunks, human bodies have some give to them. In addition to this, if you run into something solid and you push harder, if it's like a chunk of solid snow or ice, you're going to break through it. And when it comes to a human body, the poles are not meant to stab you. When it comes to finding someone under the snow, every minute matters. They have a very small window to work with 15 minutes being the kind of max for a person to be found and having them still have a good chance for survival. Of course, suffocation in the snow is not the only way a person can die in an avalanche. The snow has a way of filling every crevice, and it solidifies quickly once the snow comes to a stop. As a person breathes, their warm breath starts to melt the snow around their face, and this might sound like a good thing, but in actuality, this can cause problems when the immediate snow melts. The snow surrounding it is still ice cold. The water that has formed from the melting snow, along with the condensation, sticks to a person's skin as a lack of oxygen starts to slow down a person's respiratory rate. That body warmth is no longer there, so the freezing snow starts to lower the temperature of that water and condensation, and this creates a mask of ice over a person's face, further supplementing suffocation as an outcome. But it is the beating a person takes after being caught up in the tumbling snow that can be even more devastating. When a person suffocates under the snow, they usually lose consciousness before their breathing stops. And so while they might be aware that they are trapped under the snow, which has to be terrifying, they usually lose consciousness around 4 minutes. But being trapped in the snow and in a significant amount of pain due to broken bones, blunt force trauma, can keep you conscious longer. But this does not slow down the suffocation process. It just keeps you conscious for a longer period of time. Then, of course, the blunt force trauma can be a contributing factor in the death of a person long before the snow stops moving. But there is difficulty in finding a person under the snow. Technology has advanced greatly to allow for better options to finding people, but one of the most rudimentary ways is using these avalanche probes to locate people. During this process, searchers will stand in a line, sometimes elbow to elbow, sometimes with 3 feet between them, and together they move a step forward, stab the probes into the snow, determine if they feel anything. And if nothing, they remove the poles, they take another step, and start the process over until someone finds something. But you can't guarantee that a person is lying flat in the snow. They might be at an angle, the perfect angle that 2 people can cross their path and the probes will miss them. They could be contorted into an odd position, upside down, or crumbled into a ball. You just never know. As Joe and Brad and several others are probing the snow, all they can do is trust the process, trust their training, and hope that they find him in time. About 10 minutes into the search, there is a shout that they got him, and search members swap out their probes for shovels. Again, avalanche snow is very, very hard and very compact, and you don't want to injure a person by shoveling too aggressively, so they are kind of shaving off the snow as they shovel. As they go, this is a lot of work, and so they form a line so that as a person tires, they can swap out for the next person in line. The snow is so dense and heavy that it actually takes them about 30 seconds of shoveling as fast as they can before people start switching out. To be clear, this is not snow that you are shoveling out of your driveway. This is something that you probably can't comprehend unless you have experience with it. As they go, they keep a careful eye out for any signs that they are close to him. And finally, he is there. He's at an angle, meaning that they were lucky to find him so quickly. And when they clear his face, they find that he is not breathing. Digging out the rest of him, they carefully extract him from the snow and start CPR. He is, again, not breathing. He has no pulse, and as they are trying to bring him back, they realize that he has trauma to his neck and his chin. While they still continue to do CPR and take him to the hospital, it is clear that during the course of the avalanche, he had broken his neck and he would not be coming back. Joe's next task after seeing Albert off to the hospital is to talk to Albert's fiancée, Joni. When he finds her, he finds that one of their friends is with her, and as he stands in the street looking at Joni and Joni looking at him, Joni screams and he begins to cry. There is frustration that they still have to search for these 2 missing boys, and if they hadn't tried to climb a mountain in a blizzard, Albert would still be alive. But the rescue crews and teams had to process the loss of their friend and fellow teammate. Luckily, it was shortly after this that Jeff and Hugh were located and rescued on January 25th. So that meant that this crew didn't need to keep their professional work hats on long. But that doesn't dismiss the horrendous emotions that swelled in all of them. Sadness, grief, anger. Nothing is going to make the situation better, and saying that Albert is in a better place doesn't make anyone feel any better. And this is likely amplified by the fact that Joe was the one who sent Albert and Michael into the path of the avalanche. He couldn't have possibly predicted that this would happen, but I would guess that there is some guilt that still weighs heavy. But as time passes, Joe began to find himself feeling some sympathy for Jeff and Hugh. They had both suffered as well, and Joe found that he couldn't bring himself to hate them, especially years later when he began to see what both Hugh and Jeff did with their suffering. Jeff would become a pastor and focused on counseling on those who were in the throes of crisis. Hugh, as we covered in the last episode, used his drive not to let the loss of his legs interfere with the ability to still live an athletic life. Looking back, these men and women who set out into the dark, into perilous peaks, once in a century storms, or even on a perfectly sunshiny day, they may be called heroes. They are also human. Humans who have a strong desire to help those who need it and guide those who don't. They hold bravery in their hearts and compassion for those who walk the trails. If you want to listen to the episode about Hugh and Jeff, please check out episode 30. I will be linking it in the description for you. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me on your Wednesday. I appreciate you being here. For everyone who celebrates, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. We will talk next week. Bye. What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.